It's a really provocative title, and it got me thinking because today's deep dive is about a voting bloc that, well, it seemed to defy expectations, women in the 2024 election. We're going to unpack the why behind some of those crazy headlines. You might be surprised by what we uncover.
It's definitely been a topic that's sparked a lot of debate, a lot of head scratching.
For sure.
I think the results, especially when it comes to those female voters, it wasn't what many, including the Democrats, I think, had anticipated.
Let's set the scene a little bit. Trump won.
He did.
Both the Electoral College and the popular vote. So considering all of the hot button issues that we saw throughout the campaign, a lot of analysts expected women to vote overwhelmingly against him, but it didn't really play out that way. In fact, The Guardian even called it a political earthquake.
Yeah, and that unexpected outcome, it really highlights just how complex the female electorate really is.
Yeah.
It challenges those easy assumptions, I think, that we tend to make about how women as, one big group vote.
Right. It's not a monolith.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's dig into one of the most talked about groups.
Right.
White women voters. For over 70 years, they've only voted majority Democrat twice, in 1964 and 1996. But Trump won them over in 2016, 2020, and now, again, 2024.
Yeah.
Why this consistent pattern?
Well, research coming out of the Pew Research Center suggests that education plays a big role. White women without college degrees have consistently leaned Republican, while those with degrees are, a little bit more divided. But even among those college-educated white women, Trump made gains in this election. And it suggests that something beyond just education is at play here.
So what else could be driving this? I mean, could it be economic anxiety? Do they just prioritize a different set of issues?
I mean, economic concerns definitely played a part, but for some, Trump's messaging on things like immigration and national security, that really resonated, even if they disagreed with him on other topics. And it seems like those issues overshadowed other concerns that voters might have had.
It's like that two-faced nation concept coming to life, right?
Yeah.
Where people are voting based on a specific anxiety, even if it contradicts maybe some of their other beliefs.
Right.
It's so fascinating and complex. But let's move on to another demographic, younger women.
Okay.
I've always thought of them as a more liberal-leaning group. Was I wrong?
It's not quite so simple. While many expected young women to be a strong force against Trump, he actually did better with them this time around than he did in 2020.
That's shocking to me, especially because his campaign seems so laser-focused on young men this time.
Yeah.
All those appearances on podcasts like Joe Rogan, that felt very targeted.
You're right. There was a definite strategy there to attract young men. But despite that, he still managed to increase his appeal among young women. And, this really contradicts this assumption that, young people, and especially young women, are automatically more progressive.
So what's going on here? Why are young women seemingly breaking with those expectations? Mm-hmm. Is it the influence of online personalities, podcasts that are targeting men? Or is there something deeper?
I think it's a mix of factors.
Yeah.
First, you can't underestimate the power of influencers, especially online. Even if a message is intended for one audience, it can easily reach others just through social media. Think of it like a ripple effect.
So even if they're aiming at young men, it can still reach young women.
Exactly, just through their social networks and who they're connected with online. But it's not just those influencers.
Right.
You also have to consider the economic anxieties that this generation faces.
They're inheriting quite a mess.
They are. Student loan debt, a tough job market. I mean, the rising cost of living, it's just really difficult. And it seems that these economic pressures kind of overshadowed other concerns for a lot of young women.
So even if things like, abortion rights and social justice are important to them,
right,
those concerns took a back seat to the immediate pressure of economic survival.
Yeah, and data from Tufts University supports this. Economic stability really did trump social issues for a significant portion of young voters, and this was reflected in exit polls too, where the economy consistently topped the list of concerns for young voters.
Okay, so we've got economic anxiety. It's impacting both white women and younger women. But let's pivot to an issue that a lot of people were expecting to be huge EE this election. Abortion, after all, was a major factor in the 2022 midterms. And of course, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, that was a political earthquake.
It was, and you're absolutely right. The expectation was that abortion rights would be a primary motivator for women voters in this election. But, surprisingly, its perceived importance plummeted.
Plummeted? Seriously, I mean, how is that even possible after everything that's happened?
I know, it's baffling, isn't it? But the data is clear. Only 13% of voters said abortion was their top issue, which is a significant drop from 44% in 2022.
Wow, that's a huge drop.
It is.
So what happened? Did voters just forget about the issue? Did something else become more important?
It's likely a combination of things. Voter fatigue is one possibility. After years of intense focus on this issue, some voters might have just felt overwhelmed or even disillusioned. There's also the possibility that some felt their vote wouldn't change anything, especially in states where abortion access is already severely limited.
There's a sense of hopelessness, like, what's the point of voting if nothing's going to change?
Right.
And then, of course, there's that ever-present issue of the economy.
Exactly. And research indicates that economic anxieties outweighed social issues for a lot of voters this time around. It seems that for many, economic stability just became the priority.
It's fascinating how those different issues, how they kind of take center stage depending on, I guess, the political climate, what's going on in people's lives. But let's talk about something that caught my attention. A tactic the Harris campaign used targeting women, particularly in conservative households.
Oh, interesting. Tell me more.
They essentially told women, hey, your vote is secret. No one needs to know who you voted for. The idea was to empower those women who might feel pressure to vote a certain way, especially, within their families or communities where Trump was really popular.
It's a bold strategy for sure. I'm curious to know how it played out.
Well, here's the kicker. It backfired.
Really?
And it backfired big time.
Why do you think that is? It seems like a pretty straightforward message.
You'd think so, right?
Yeah.
But it seems the campaign may have misjudged the psychology of conservative women.
Okay, let's unpack this. What went wrong with this whole secret voting approach?
From what I've read, it seems like they didn't fully grasp, really, the motivations and the priorities of those voters. They assumed that fear and secrecy were the driving forces behind their decisions.
So they were assuming that these women were being coerced or pressured.
Exactly. But instead of, feeling empowered, that message came across as, condescending. Almost like the campaign was saying, you're not capable of making your own choices.
So instead of feeling empowered, these women felt patronized.
Exactly.
Like their agency was being questioned.
Exactly. It's a classic example of how, even when you have good intentions, messaging can completely miss the mark if it's not really grounded in a genuine understanding of your audience.
Right. It's a reminder that assumptions can be dangerous, especially when we're trying to understand voter motivations. Stereotypes and generalizations just don't cut it.
Absolutely. And this secret voting backfire, it's a perfect example of that.
Yeah.
But before we move on, I'm curious, what are your initial thoughts on why this strategy flopped so spectacularly?
I think the campaign may have underestimated the complexity of these women's political identities. They assumed a level of fear and secrecy that might not have been representative of the actual experiences of a lot of conservative women.
That's a really interesting point. It's like they reduced these women to a single dimension, afraid to vote their conscience, without acknowledging all those multifaceted reasons behind their political choices.
Exactly, and that's something we'll explore further in the next part of our deep dive. We'll delve a little deeper into the motivations and priorities of conservative women voters, and we'll examine why this whole secret voting message backfired so dramatically.
Ooh, this is getting good. I can't wait to unpack that more. For our listeners, make sure you come back for part 2, where we'll continue to explore these fascinating trends. It's a real eye-opener. Okay, so we just left off talking about this secret voting tactic that the Harris campaign tried and how it totally backfired with conservative women. I'm still reeling from it, to be honest.
Yeah, it's definitely a head scratcher, especially when you think about the intention behind it on the surface. It seemed like a good idea, empower women who might feel pressure to vote a certain way, but the execution, well, that's where things went wrong.
I'm dying to know more about why it flopped. What were the underlying assumptions that led the campaign to think this would be effective?
It seems like they may have oversimplified the motivations of conservative women, They assumed that, fear and secrecy were the primary drivers of their voting decisions. They overlooked that complex web of values and beliefs and experiences that really shape people's political choices.
So they painted this picture of conservative women being trapped, unable to express their true political preferences. It's like they needed to be rescued by this secret ballot.
Exactly, and that's where the condescension comes in. By implying that these women needed to hide their votes, the campaign inadvertently sent a message that they weren't capable of making their own informed decisions.
Which, let's be real, is incredibly insulting. It's like saying, we know better than you what's good for you. No wonder it backfired.
Yeah, it's a classic example of what happens when campaigns fail to truly understand and respect their target audience, and they end up, talking down to them instead of actually engaging in a meaningful conversation.
And that lack of genuine engagement can be a real turnoff for voters, especially those who feel like their values and beliefs are being misrepresented or dismissed.
Absolutely. Conservative women are not a monolithic group, They have diverse perspectives and priorities and reasons for supporting the candidates they do. To assume otherwise is not only inaccurate, but also disrespectful.
So instead of focusing on this perceived need for secrecy, maybe the campaign should have focused on understanding and addressing the actual concerns of conservative women.
Yeah, that's a great point. What are those concerns? How do they view the role of government? What are their economic anxieties? What are their hopes and dreams for their families and their communities? These are the questions that campaigns should be asking.
It's about moving beyond those simplistic labels and stereotypes and engaging with voters as individuals. people with their own unique stories and perspectives.
Exactly. Having those difficult conversations, listening with empathy, and acknowledging the validity of different viewpoints, even when we disagree with them.
Because at the end of the day, we're all trying to figure out how to create a better future for ourselves and our families. And that requires understanding and working together, even across those political divides.
Yeah, that's a crucial point. We can't just dismiss or demonize those who hold different political beliefs. We need to find ways to bridge those divides and build a more inclusive and respectful political dialogue.
So going back to the 2024 election, it seems like a lot of these missed opportunities for genuine engagement, they played a role in the outcome, especially when you consider how things like economic anxiety, social issues, and even the influence of online personalities all factored into the voting decisions of women.
It's a complex tapestry, isn't it? And unraveling those threads, understanding the intricate ways that these factors intertwine, is essential for anyone who wants to understand the political landscape, not just in this past election, but in the years to come.
It's funny, we started this deep dive talking about the book Two-Faced Nation, and it seems like that title perfectly captures these complexities that we've been discussing.
It really does, because it's not just about individual voters having these seemingly contradictory beliefs or priorities. It's about the two-faced nature of our political system itself.
What do you mean by that?
Well, on the one hand, we have this ideal of a democracy where every voice matters, where we engage in these respectful debates and where we strive for compromise and consensus. But on the other hand, we have this reality of political polarization, where campaigns often resort to divisive rhetoric and simplistic messaging that fails to capture the nuance of voters' lived experiences.
So it's like this gap between the aspirational ideal of democracy and the messy, often frustrating reality of how politics actually plays out.
Exactly, and bridging that gap requires us to move beyond those simplistic narratives and engage in a more nuanced and respectful dialogue.
It's about recognizing that there's more to each voter than meets the eye, that their decisions are driven by a complex interplay of factors, and that understanding of those complexities is key to creating a more representative and responsive democracy.
Absolutely, and it's not just about understanding voters, it's also about understanding how campaigns operate, how they target different demographics, and how their messaging can either resonate with voters or alienate them.
And speaking of campaigns and messaging, there's one more aspect of the 2024 election that I think we need to unpack. The role of the economy. We touched on it earlier, but I think it deserves a deeper dive.
I agree. Economic anxiety was clearly a major factor in this election, and it's important to understand how it shaped voting decisions, particularly among women.
So for our listeners who are ready to go even deeper into this economic rabbit hole, join us for part 3, where we'll explore how the economy influenced the 2024 election and what it might mean for the future of American politics. All right, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into the 2024 election. And we've been unpacking some pretty surprising trends, especially, how women voted. And we keep coming back to this idea of economic anxiety playing a huge role.
Yeah, it's really impossible to ignore it. The economy was a dominant theme throughout the entire campaign, and it clearly resonated with voters, across the spectrum, but particularly with women.
That makes sense, right? When you're worried about putting food on the table, paying rent, or dealing with student loan debt, those concerns, they tend to kind of overshadow everything else. But I'm curious to know, how did this economic anxiety specifically impact women's voting decisions?
Well, research shows that women across age and racial demographics were more likely than men to report feeling financially stressed in the months leading up to the election, and this anxiety had translated directly into voting behavior.
So even though we've been talking about how women aren't a monolithic voting bloc, it seems like this economic pressure created a kind of shared experience, a unifying concern that transcended other differences. Exactly.
And exit polls showed that women who prioritized the economy as their top issue voted for Trump by a significant margin. In fact, among young voters, that margin was a whopping 78% to 21%. It's clear that economic concerns trumped social issues for many, even in the face of major changes, like the overturning of Roe v. Wade.
It's like that hierarchy of needs we talked about earlier. When your basic needs for security, stability are threatened other concerns, even those really deeply held moral or social beliefs, they kind of take a back seat.
Precisely. And this highlights a really crucial point for those who want to understand and engage with women voters going forward. Economic empowerment is key.
So it's not just about talking points, campaign promises.
Right.
It's about creating tangible solutions that address those real economic challenges that women face. Things like affordable childcare, paid family leave, closing that gender pay gap.
Absolutely. Those are the types of policies that can make a real difference in women's lives and really empower them to participate fully in the economy and, in our democracy.
It's about moving beyond those surface level conversations about women's issues and really tackling those systemic barriers that prevent women from achieving economic security and equality.
It's about recognizing that economic justice is social justice. When women are economically empowered, it benefits everyone, not just women themselves.
Right.
It strengthens families, communities, and our nation as a whole.
A rising tide lifts all boats.
Exactly.
When women thrive, everyone thrives.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering about kind of the flip side of this.
Yep.
We've talked about how Trump's messaging on the economy resonated with some women.
Yeah.
But what about those who didn't buy into those promises? What were their concerns?
Well, for many, Trump's economic policies were seen as benefiting the wealthy at the expense of the working class.
Right.
They worried about rising healthcare costs, cuts to social programs, and a lack of investment in things like education and infrastructure.
So it wasn't just about economic anxiety in general.
Right.
It was about a specific vision for how the economy should work, who should benefit, and who should bear the burden.
Exactly. And those differing visions, those fundamental disagreements about the role of government and the distribution of wealth, I mean, those are at the heart of our current political divide.
Seems like a real challenge here for those who want to bridge that divide.
Yeah.
How do you appeal to voters with such vastly different economic priorities and anxieties?
It requires honesty, empathy, and a willingness to listen and understand. It requires moving beyond those simplistic talking points and engaging in a genuine conversation about the challenges that we face as a nation and the best ways to address them.
And it requires recognizing that there are no easy answers, no quick fixes. It's about finding that common ground, building consensus, working together to create a more just and equitable economy for all.
It's about shifting the conversation from us versus them to we the people, because ultimately we're all in this together. Our fates are intertwined, and our success as a nation depends on our ability to work together to create a better future for everyone.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left with this lingering question. What does all of this mean for the future of American politics? We've seen how economic anxiety, social issues, the power of messaging all shape the 2024 election, but how do we move forward from here?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And there's no easy answer, but I think this election has taught us a few important lessons. First, we need to listen to voters, especially those whose voices are often marginalized or ignored. Second, we need to move beyond those simplistic narratives and engage in a more nuanced and respectful dialogue. And third, we need to focus on creating tangible solutions that address the real challenges that people face, especially when it comes to the economy.
It's about understanding the complexities, challenging those assumptions, and working together to create a more just and equitable society for all. And that's a message that we can all take to heart, regardless of our political beliefs.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. Thank you for joining us on this fascinating journey. We hope you've gained some new insights into the 2024 election and the complexities of the American electorate.
It's been a pleasure.
And remember, if you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more thought-provoking conversations about the issues that matter most. Thanks for listening.